And good morning to you, everyone. This is Brant Hart, your regular host for the program called The Legal Forum. And we interview lawyers each week with different specialties about different topics that are of interest to our listeners. And today we have Matt Arnold, who grew up right here in Charlotte. He attended Carmel Junior High and Providence Senior High. He played basketball on a scholarship at Belmont Abbey, and after graduating cum laude with a degree in psychology, he went on to attend UNC Chapel Hill on a full academic scholarship. And Matt had his first trial before graduating from law school, and after graduation he returned to Charlotte to begin his practice handling insurance defense litigation for several major insurance companies, and he went on to handle high-value mortgage fraud and business litigation cases. In 2007, Matt and his law partner started their own firm, Arnold & Smith, PLLC, in Uptown Charlotte. He mainly focuses on the practice of family law cases, including divorce, child custody, child support, alimony, equitable distribution, and other matrimonial law matters. Matt, we're so glad that you could be with us here this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you.
All right, and today we are talking about divorce matters. And our first question here, Matt, what should a person look for when researching a divorce attorney?
That's really a very, very, very good question, and it's a difficult task for anybody to tackle. Inevitably, when someone's looking for someone like me, stress is high, and generally things aren't going very well in their lives, and it's a difficult time to make a big decision like that. Often things are in crisis and things are happening very quickly, and people are under a great deal of stress. But nonetheless, even under those circumstances, it's very important to make sure a person makes the right decision. And there are some tools out there, some strategies that can be employed that can help someone through such a situation. There are a lot of lawyers in the world. There are a lot of lawyers in Charlotte. There are a lot of lawyers everywhere. Anybody who reads the news can see that. And those lawyers are just like anybody else. They differ in what sort of work they do. They differ in how well they do their work, just like a mechanic or a doctor or a dentist or anybody else. And the question is, first, I think, how to find somebody who knows what they're doing, who can handle family law matters. And there are a number of ways to first do that. And the sort of time-honored tradition is to talk to your friends, family, neighbors, other folks who have gone through similar situations and see if they know of anyone or if they've worked with anyone who they can recommend. I think most people recognize that since the beginning of lawyers have gotten most of their work through word-of-mouth referrals. So there's really no better way, in my view, to get sort of an idea of somebody who might be a good fit than to talk to other people who've been through it, who can tell you firsthand what their experiences have been like. Now, that's sort of the traditional method. There are sort of more modern methods available, and most of them are the result of the internet. The internet has accelerated and amplified just about everything in our lives, and one of the things that it has done is it has made sort of the word-of-mouth referral process faster and more open to the public. And there are ways, there are websites, there are credentialing mechanisms available for finding a lawyer who does family law and sort of seeing what other people have to say about that lawyer. It's much like the word-of-mouth referral system that I described before, but it's faster and you have a larger sample set. Probably the most widely used website that does that sort of thing is called Avvo, www.avvo.com. And that's a website where people, past clients, can go online and they can give feedback on their experiences with their lawyers. And it's like any sort of review website or any feedback kind of website. They rate, they give critiques and reviews and things like that. So that's and you can search that website by practice area, by geographic location, and so on and so forth. And you can see that's a really good website. It gives information about any sort of disciplinary matters the lawyers had. It gives information about how long they've practiced, publications they've had, notable trials or cases that they've worked on. So it's a good starting point. There's also a website that's similar to that. It's called superlawyers.com, and that is an entity that identifies what they call super lawyers and rising stars. And that website, it's not quite as focused on the consumer review. It's more of a peer review process, and there are lawyers who are deemed by that outfit to be super lawyers or rising stars. Also, Google has reviews built into it. So if one Googles Charlotte divorce lawyer, for example, you can see a number of lawyers in Charlotte who have set up their web presence to identify themselves as doing that sort of practice area. And Google also allows consumers to give reviews and ratings and so on and so forth. Now, that is the first step, really, in my opinion, is to sort of take a survey of other folks and see what they've found. Now, this another thing that I think is smart to consider is that the North Carolina Bar started decades ago a specialist program, and that is a program where a lawyer can voluntarily seek a specialization certification through the North Carolina Bar. And there are a number of specialization programs that a lawyer can seek. And there is a family law specialization certification. And most lawyers who've secured that specialization are not bashful about identifying themselves as family law specialists. I'm a family law specialist. There are a number of specialists in Charlotte. And that process it's challenging. It's not easy. It requires subjective endorsements, so to speak, or critiques by other lawyers in the community, by judges. It requires a challenging written test that has to be taken typically up in Raleigh. It requires a certain number of years in practice, 5 years at least in practice, focusing on family law. And it requires that the lawyer focus their continuing education classes that we're all required to take on family law matters. And if a lawyer is certified as a family law specialist, that's a pretty good indicator that they know what they're doing. Now, all of what I've just described, and please cut me off if I'm going on too long on this question, but it's a very important question, and I think it's a decision people need to take very seriously. All of that is focused exclusively on finding somebody who knows what they're doing, who can do family law and is competent in that practice area. In my opinion, that's not the end of the analysis, though, in finding your family law attorney, because as important as finding a lawyer who knows what they're doing is finding a lawyer whose personality and style clicks with you. And that's really, really important because these sorts of cases are incredibly difficult. They are incredibly emotional. They touch on just about every emotive nerve a person can have. They typically involve your relationship with your children, your relationship with your hard-earned money, or your retirement, your ongoing income. And these things are issues that impact people very intimately. And it's important to have a lawyer with whom you agree and in whom you have confidence. Because if you don't have a good relationship with your lawyer, what is already a difficult case can become virtually impossible to get through if you and your lawyer are not paddling in the same direction. So I think it's a two-step process, really. First, I think you need to identify people in your location who are competent in the subject matter. And that can be done through the mechanisms I described. The second step, I think, is going out and talking to some of these lawyers. You go interview them. You run your case by them. You see what their feedback is. They're called legal opinions for a reason. The law is not a math problem at its essence. It is a social exercise. It is a situation where different cases can be viewed differently by different lawyers and by different judges. And it's important to make sure that you have confidence in them and you can see them as being your advocate, somebody who potentially may be in court fighting for you. So if I were in that situation, I would first identify those who I think know what they're doing in that subject matter, and then I'd pick 3, probably, maybe 4, and I'd go talk to them, and I'd check them out, and I'd see if I could envision them as being my advocate in court and somebody who I would have faith in and confidence in to get me through what typically is one of the very most difficult situations a person can go through. So I think that's the answer to a short question, a very long answer to a short question. I apologize.
No, Matt, that is really important. I think with any kind of legal cases that you get an attorney that you feel comfortable with and someone that you know is competent. And Matt, since we are on radio, be sure to kind of pull the microphone up, and remember you're talking to the listeners here. If you need to kind of pull the mic to you or whatever, let's make sure our listeners can hear you. So here's a question that I've always wondered about, Matt. In what circumstances can a person get an annulment rather than a divorce?
Well, and that's a great question, and it's one of those questions where and lawyers who do what I do, we kind of tend to get questions over time that seem to originate mostly from popular media, from movies and things like that. And I think that probably movies have given people an inaccurate expectation with respect to the notion of an annulment, at least in North Carolina. I don't know how other states treat that, but in North Carolina, an annulment is it's not available in the sort of traditional circumstances that I think we see in movies, which are, my goodness, we got married yesterday, we made a tremendous mistake. Today, the day after the marriage, we want an annulment. And can you do something about that? Under North Carolina law, no. Under North Carolina law, an annulment is only available under very narrow circumstances. And those circumstances are things like a bigamous marriage, where one person or the other person is already married to somebody else when they married the second person. And sometimes that happens for nefarious reasons, and somebody knows what's going on and they do it intentionally. But frequently it's an accident. Somebody thought that certain paperwork went through and it didn't, or so on and so forth. Another instance where it can be where a marriage can be annulled under North Carolina law is in the case of fraud, typically with respect to ability to conceive children. And also, if two individuals are too closely related familially, a marriage can be annulled. But other than those sort of very, very narrow circumstances, a divorce is really going to be the only option. And if all you've got is a situation where you wake up the next day and you say, oh my goodness, we shouldn't have done this, chances are an annulment is not going to be available. But nonetheless, it is very, very wise and very well worth the money spent to go talk to a lawyer and make sure, because you certainly wouldn't want to have it available to you and miss the opportunity if that's what you needed.
Can age also be a factor for annulment? I think I remember a situation where somebody in my neighborhood had gotten married and maybe didn't have the parents' consent to do that, and the parents were able to annul that marriage. Is that an option in North Carolina?
Off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure. it's funny, I think a good lawyer is smart enough to say, I don't know, when they don't know. And I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. I would need to go pull a little bit of law. And lawyers, we don't know it all off the top of the head. We got big libraries full of books, and we know how to go find it.
Yeah, that's just like radio people here, Matt. Sometimes we have to go Google things to answer questions for our listeners and so forth. What are the rules to determine if a person is legally separated from a spouse?
North Carolina law is in my opinion, rather, I think our law is pretty bad on that point. And this is why I don't like our law on that point, because it's a bad test, I think. The test is if two people stop cohabiting, meaning they don't live under the same roof anymore, and one of them has the then existing intent not to resume the marital relationship. That, importantly, does not have to be a stated intent, meaning they don't have to tell the other spouse that they no longer intend to resume the marital relationship. And that test, I think, has resulted in and can result in some difficult circumstances for people, particularly if you have a case which happens, I think, more and more these days, where for one reason or the other, one spouse lives out of town for large periods of time for work or whatnot. You can conceive of a situation where one spouse lives or maintains a separate residence in another town for work purposes, and maybe is there for long stretches of time, and two people, generally that's how they live their life, and they think they're still married, and then perhaps things turn bad one day, and one spouse or the other says, oh yeah, by the way, 3 months ago when we initiated this living circumstance, I had the intention at that time to be separated from you and not return to the marital relationship. And there are cases, I've seen cases where that can be after a year. And then you end up fighting potentially over what the person's then existing non-stated state of mind was. And that can be a difficult situation. And frankly, it can put the unsuspecting spouse in a very, very difficult situation.
Okay, Matt, and how long does the divorce process typically last?
Well, under North Carolina law, and most states have different structures for how this works. Frequently, people use the word divorce in an overly broad sense, and I'll talk about this in two ways. One, the divorce process itself. A divorce is simply the termination of the marital relationship. That is the final decree that a judge enters that severs the marital relationship. And under North Carolina law, two folks have to be separated for 1 year before they can be divorced. So that goes back to what I just talked about a moment ago with respect to what the North Carolina standard is for determining separation. And it's important because that 1 year runs whenever two people begin to be separated. Now, that is just to get the divorce. That is just to have the marriage severed. So you're looking at a year before the paperwork can be filed, and then generally it's 6 to 8 weeks from filing of the divorce petition until a judge will sign the divorce decree, at least in Mecklenburg County. And, different counties process the paperwork at different paces and things like that. So that's just to get the divorce. Now, there are several related issues that have to be resolved as part of a divorce, and that those are things like child custody and child support, spousal support, which is either post-separation support or alimony, and equitable distribution. That is the division of marital assets and debt that were accumulated during the marriage. And those issues are generally negotiated and or litigated about independently from that 1 year time frame for the divorce. And they're interrelated, though not they don't have to be resolved at the same time. So generally, I would say in a cooperative situation, the nuts and bolts of the divorce, meaning the custody, the support, the alimony, the property division, those items can be wrapped up fairly expeditiously if you have two folks. Generally, you have some, if they both have lawyers who can get their clients to get together their financial documents and get them exchanged and get them analyzed. That sort of thing can be done in a matter of a couple months in some cases. Generally, if you end up in court, you're looking at 12 to 14 to 16 months, usually in Mecklenburg County, before you come on for a permanent trial on something like child custody. And that is from the day you file the complaint. That's not from the date of separation. And there are certainly nightmare cases. There are cases that just go on and go on and go on. I was in court all week this week, actually, with a case that was filed more than 3 years ago. And that was for only a 7-year marriage. So the answer to that question, the short answer is that it can vary dramatically. In your typical case, you're looking at probably 2 months to 8 months if things go reasonably well. If the situation devolves into World War III in court, they can go on for years.
Okay, and of course the $1 million question here, Matt, is how much does a divorce typically cost?
And that's another question where the answer to that is not dissimilar from my answer to the question about how long it takes. And that makes sense because most lawyers who do the sort of work that I do, we operate on an hourly basis. And the more fighting that goes on, the more cost there is for individuals. And unfortunately, sometimes the fighting is warranted and there are really issues that have to be resolved through the adversarial process and have to be decided by judges. But unfortunately, as I think most people know intuitively and through experience, sometimes people fight these sorts of cases because they're emotionally charged, because they're upset about the circumstances surrounding the separation and divorce. And that's understandable. But it is the lawyer's role, and this is why you have a lawyer, it is the lawyer's role to come in and be an objective, unemotional advocate for the individual. So I would say that a fairly typical divorce to be negotiated with another lawyer on the other side can cost as little as $5,000, maybe up to $10,000 if it's a high asset case and you have to go back and forth and maybe have a mediation or something like that. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the anomalous cases. You've got the cases where people fight over things that are not worth fighting over, don't need to be fought over. People are fighting for emotional reasons or for principle. And those cases routinely run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And in most cases, that's just not warranted. And it's unfortunate when situations turn that bad. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the client to control that process, because the lawyer is the navigator, and the client is the captain of the ship. The client makes the decisions based on the lawyer's advice, and that's really, those are unfortunate cases, and unfortunately we do see them.
Well, Matt, it looks like we've barely scratched the surface here, but we got a little bit less than we got about another 3 minutes left in this segment of the program. So if you'd like to just make some closing remarks and let us know about your firm and how they can get in touch with you if they have other questions.
Sure, thank you. As you mentioned earlier, the name of our firm is Arnold & Smith, PLLC. Our website is www.arnoldsmithlaw.com, arnoldsmithlaw.com. And that is really our online resume. That tells, you can find out an awful lot of information about us. As you mentioned before, Brad Smith and I, we both grew up in Charlotte. We're from Charlotte. We're raising our families here. We're very entrenched in the community. We consider this to be our town, and we take great pride in what we do. You can find out our practice areas on our website. And generally speaking, we're a litigation firm. We have 9 lawyers. We're located at the corner of 5th and McDowell Street in downtown Charlotte, across the street from the main post office branch in the historic John Price Car House. It's a big yellow Victorian historical home. We have 9 lawyers. We handle family law matters, criminal defense matters, bankruptcy matters, construction litigation matters, business litigation matters, and we also handle personal injury matters, which includes civil rights actions in 1983 cases. We are generally advocates. We go to court. We fight for people, and we try to keep our role in that process as objective as possible. It's our job to fight for people, and we take great pride in doing it the right way. And I think that's about it.
Well, we are happy to have had you with us today, Matt. We were glad to meet Brad a few weeks ago, and nice to have you also. And again, we do appreciate that. I think you especially gave us some good advice at the beginning of the program, because I think even what you said about finding a good divorce attorney will also hold true for any other legal matters that you need handled, that you should check out these websites and word of mouth and so forth there. So maybe we didn't get to talk about as many of the subjects today as we should have, but I do think you gave our listeners a good foundation for handling any kind of legal matter, and we certainly thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Sure, I'm happy to do it. Thank you for having me.